Hi, and welcome to episode 66 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Stephen Hamblin, postdoc at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and I'm joined here by Tom and Bug.
Hi, I'm Tom Housley. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Stirling and currently in academic limbo.
Hi, I'm Gwen Pearson. I write for Wired about insects and go by sometimes the pseudonym Bug Girl.
Yeah, I can't stop calling you Bug. I don't know why. Gwen
Everybody
just doesn't
calls me
work.
Bug. Seriously, everybody calls me Bug. Nobody uses my real name. Everybody just says, "Hey, Bug." So that's totally normal.
People on the street wandering
Yeah,
by.
if you call me by my name, I'm going to think you're my mom, and so it's going to really disorient me.
All right, I'll try not to do that then.
There is
All right.
an alarming resemblance, though.
As one would hope. And
Moving
we're joined today by our guest, Dr. David Gorski, who is a surgical oncologist and is in the Department of Surgery at Wayne State University. He's also a well-known blogger who blogs at Respectful Insolence on science blogs and has been a scourge into any of the complementary medicine and crazy people out there. So, David, thanks for joining us.
Hey, you forgot managing editor of Science-Based Medicine.
Yeah.
Yes. That was actually on the list. I didn't even say it.
Yes, indeed. So thanks for inviting me. What can I do you for?
Well, how about some respectful insolence?
Well, for you guys, I guess it'll be respectful, unlike for the quacks for whom it's not.
So, we can start there. I've been reading your blog for years, on and off, and I've always really enjoyed it. I have to ask though, a question that's been bugging me is how many irony meters have you owned over the years, and how many are dead?
You did notice that another one was destroyed today, right?
Yeah, I saw that.
But Dr. Oz is apparently going to testify about diet scams in front of the Senate.
Yes. I've always kind of wondered if he isn't like some sort of, like if he isn't actually just playing a role, and then one day he's just going to take off the mask and say, "Oh, I was, this is all bullshit. I was kidding all along."
It's all been a really elaborate thing by Stephen Colbert.
Yeah.
Sadly, well, to be honest, I don't know if he believes this stuff or not, but he's definitely playing a role, on TV, and I have no idea if he believes the role or not.
So more generally, you've spent a lot of time writing and talking about people like anti-vaccinationists and cancer quacks and things like this. And can you give us a rundown on how you got into this and what started you on this blogging path?
A long time ago, in a city far, far away, I guess, Chicago, which is not that far, but sometime around the late 90s, I discovered Usenet. Does anyone remember Usenet?
Yes.
I do.
I would say, has anyone ever used Usenet here?
I
Yes.
do. That's where I first used my pseudonym.
Okay then, because somehow my pathway into skepticism started in a way you might not have expected. I found, perusing Usenet one day, I found the Holocaust denial discussion groups.
Ooh.
And I was so freaked out and unbelieving of what I was seeing there that I came to a point where I started dipping my toe in there and starting to refute things. And the interesting thing was it was medical stuff, that was coming up, like, the claim that Zyklon B couldn't possibly have killed so many Jews, and the various claims that Holocaust deniers used. So it started from there, and this was probably 1998 or 99, and then I discovered the alternative medicine discussion groups, and then I discovered the cancer quacks, the anti-vaccinationists, and all of that, and I was gradually drawn in. So around about 2004, as I recall, it was a gray December Saturday. For some reason, something got me. I don't know what. I started the original Blogspot blog, Respectful Insolence. And it started out slow and small and kind of ballooned from there. throughout 2005, around late 2005, early 2006, I was invited to join Science Blogs, and it went from there. And then a couple of years later, Steve Novella invited me to be one of the founding members of Science-Based Medicine. Obviously, I got his attention.
So you've had a fairly storied career in this. You were with Science Blogs at the very beginning.
Not quite. I was a couple months late because of some issues with my university where I was working then, and having to report outside income and stuff. So I joined like a couple months after Science Blogs went live.
But how long have you been there now?
Since like February 2006.
Yeah. That's a pretty long time in blogging terms.
I sometimes think the reason I never moved was just because I'm too lazy. It would just be so much work to like start somewhere else.
So with the kind of things that you do, I mean, you tackle a lot of the hard issues in terms of anti-vaccinationists, for instance, and you run up against a lot of the bigger figures in this regard. You've got recurring villains in the blogging that I've noticed. But do you feel like you've had an impact in this area?
How can you know if you've ever had an impact? I do get the occasional email or comment about how I help someone, either see the light or change their minds. But, the hardcore anti-vaccinationists and the hardcore, quacks are not going to change. Or if they do, it's so rare that as to be remarkable when it happens. What I hope to do is to have information out there that the fence sitters see, some of which admittedly is ridicule, although to be honest, I really have kind of mellowed with age. I used to be a lot nastier, believe it or not. If you go back and read some of my old stuff, you'll see what I mean.
Yeah. Do you feel that there's so like a few years ago, I remember there was a huge debate, largely played out in Science Blogs actually, about Mooney and Nisbet and their framing ideas, and
yes.
And so I mean the kind of blogging that you do is in some ways very adversarial.
But not all of it. I go both ways. I have written, I do write posts that are not adversarial. Yeah, the majority probably are, but I am capable of. I like to use whatever I can think of in my toolkit, and I don't limit myself to just one method of communication. So, that's somewhat of a fair. Yeah, that's how I kind of made my rep, quite honestly. But I think I've evolved since then so that I'm not so relentlessly adversarial as I was like 8 years ago. Or 9 years ago. Oh man, it was 9 years ago. Never mind. Yeah, I am actually coming up on my 10th anniversary in December, so.
What's the 10th anniversary present for blogging?
I don't know. It might as well be 100 years in the internet
It's
internet
paper.
time.
It's paper.
Ancient.
Paper.
Ancient. It's ancient.
You get papyrus.
So Stephen was just mentioning that there's a recurring cast of villains in your blog, and I just noticed that the other day you had something new from Stanislav Brzezinski.
Well, he's actually relatively recent. If you go back and look at, I didn't really take notice of him in a big way until 2011 when his flunky started threatening Reese Morgan, with the legal threats. Before that, I had heard of him. I hadn't really looked into him. So in a way, it's kind of at least with me, but with everyone else who started piling on, it was an excellent example of the Streisand effect. Like trying to shut down Reese's criticism of him ended up, unleashing the skeptical blogosphere, or as Eric Merola, the guy who made all those two bad movies about Brzezinski, likes to say, the skeptics, dun dun dun, like with evil noise and music and.
So for those of our viewers who don't know him, can you give us a potted history of Brzezinski and what his most recent escapades have been?
Well, it's hard to boil 37 years of history down into like a couple minutes, but Brzezinski is a Polish physician, expatriate who, left Poland in the early 70s and ended up at Baylor in Houston. And he started out as actually kind of a legitimate scientist, but over that time he discovered something in urine and blood that he liked to call anti-neoplastons, which neoplasm is kind of the idea. In other words, endogenous inhibitors of cancer, or cancer progression. And, for the time it was actually a fairly novel idea. We now know that there are these sorts of substances. The problem is he never really demonstrated it in a way that was convincing. And it was so anxious to go straight to patients that he basically left Baylor, started his own private practice, and over time, treating cancer patients with these substances that he calls anti-neoplastons, ended up, the guy we know today. He's never, he's always portrayed himself as the brave maverick doctor fighting the system. He's always, he's never really published convincing evidence that his treatments work, and has tended to rely on testimonials and, the alternative medicine crowd portraying his treatment as being non-toxic, which it's not non-toxic. It can cause very bad hypernatremia, or elevated sodium, in fact, life-threatening at time in some cases. And as being able to cure patients with brain cancers that conventional oncology cannot cure. So, he's been investigated many times over the years, and somehow he always manages to get out of it. In the 90s, he rallied patients who, quite honestly believed he was their only hope. He had convinced them of this. So they would, they had demonstrations, and the FDA was brought before a congressional committee run by Joe Barton, who's still in Congress, by the way. And eventually the FDA backed down. He was allowed to start all these clinical trials, which even his lawyer basically bragged about in his book as being nothing more than an artifice to allow Brzezinski to treat patients. He was investigated again in the 2000s multiple times, and and most recently they actually did put a partial clinical hold on his activities or his clinical trials, which basically means he could keep treating patients already on the trial but could not add any new ones. And since then, he's been various patients have been trying to get the FDA to lift that hold, and have been using the same kind of PR tactics that they used back in the 90s. With mixed success. Brzezinski recently published, one of the biggest things on Brzezinski that he couldn't escape was that he had never published a completed clinical trial. He always published partial clinical trials, case reports, etc., usually in bottom-feeding journals, or even less. Recently, he's published a couple of his clinical trials, one of which as I joked, I said he published 42.5% of a clinical trial, because that's the percentage of the patients that he actually analyzed. And this last one, although it doesn't look like he covered all the patients, it was a very bad paper, very low numbers, in a journal that's published by a company that's been accused of predatory open access, pay to publish sorts of activities. So not exactly convincing, if you know what I mean.
So obviously, I used to work for a state university, and when I was using my pseudonym, I ran into all sorts of problems. I'm really curious how one of the things that I've seen you write about a lot is the sort of infiltration of alternative medicine into medical school and medical training. How does that play at home?
Well,
And you can also just take the fifth on this too,
no,
because I don't want to make things difficult for you.
if there's one good thing, one good thing about this place is that they're really, compared to a lot of the really big name schools, like there isn't as much of that stuff here. There really isn't. That's not to say it's non-existent, but there's really, compared to, say, MD Anderson, Memorial Sloan Kettering, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, there's not that much here.
So why is
how
that?
does it play? I mean, most people don't even really say much about it. It's like, I don't even know how many people, if any, around here read my blogs, which is fine by me. Occasionally someone will mention something, but in reality, most of the time we basically don't notice. The time they do notice is when, like, anti-vaccinationists decide to start writing letters to the Board of Governors demanding saying I have some horrible undisclosed conflict of interest and I'm really in the pocket of a pharmaceutical company. That caused some agita about 3 years ago, but fortunately the dean actually seemed to understand. And in fact, when she actually called me to ask me if I felt threatened, and I took the opportunity to liken the anti-vaccinationists to animal rights activists, which she immediately grasped. So.
Yeah. So why do you think, why is it that, if I was going to think about places that were peddling woo, I would not pick Harvard, Yale, some of these
we've been, over at Science-Based Medicine, we've pound our heads against the wall wondering this, not infrequently. I mean, sometimes it's a charismatic person, like Ted Kapchuk at Harvard is a big influence. Like at the University of Arizona, it's obviously Andrew Weil. He's very, other places I'm not so sure. It could be geographic, although I'm not sure why MD Anderson would, being in the middle of Texas, would be so prone to it. I was just at the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting last week, and I watched a session on integrative oncology run by some two luminaries, one of whom was from Memorial Sloan Kettering, and the other was from MD Anderson. So why? I wish I knew. I wish I knew.
5 years ago, my mother-in-law was diagnosed with gallbladder cancer, and she died from it about a year later. But during that time, while she was undergoing treatment and she was sick, of course, I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this. I started getting a lot of people giving me well-intentioned but clearly Looney Tunes advice, right?
Yes, that's unfortunately very common.
Yeah, and at the time I got frustrated, and I tended to retreat to things like I was reading your blog at the time. Actually, I remember reading it at the time, and some of the things you were fighting against, and I was comforted by it, which may sound odd, but it's.
Well, it's always gratifying to hear because you never quite know whether you're having an effect on anyone, especially. It's not like I'm Dr. Oz and have millions of people watching me every day. It's more like thousands, which is still great, but it's orders of magnitude less.
Yeah. Well, you did, but the thing that always made me wonder was that, it seemed like I was the kind of person who was likely to seek out somebody like your writings or like Science-Based Medicine website, because I am a scientist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me worry that we're talking in an echo chamber a lot of times.
Yeah, there's always that. But on the other hand, what's the answer? Like, what do you do differently? Because it's not like this doesn't pop up from time to time, in our discussions and in various, mailing lists that I belong to, devoted to this sort of thing. What do we do different? This argument comes up. If you read Science-Based Medicine, you know that this argument pops up incessantly in the comment section of various posts.
I tend to avoid comment sections, I'm not gonna lie. But if you had a magic wand, what would you do?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure what what I could do that was much different. I mean, I've tried to become, I've tried being more warm and cuddly, and that doesn't seem to work that well either. And we know that just putting the information out there is usually not enough, but in some cases it is, and I think it's enough. It's enough of the time that it's still worth doing. I think this is something that we probably need some guidance on as to what we could do better. I mean, it's a question that comes up in just skepticism in general quite frequently, but it's particularly important in medicine because of the potential consequences to health and well-being. Especially the anti-vaccine movement, case in point, which this has been bubbling up fairly frequently over the last several months. That's the anti-vaccine movement seems to wax and wane. We seem to be in a waxing phase right now. But on the other hand, there seems to be one thing that's happened that actually helped. To be honest, things are personal. Okay, so when Andrew Wakefield was stripped of his medical license in the UK, and when his original Lancet article was retracted, that gave, as much as I hate that to be the reason, it really contributed to what I perceive to be a backlash against the anti-vaccine movement. And reporters now, and some of it is quite frankly now reporters and other people had someone to personalize and a target and a very simple message to say, well, this guy, was a fraud. Like when his data was, Brian Deere showed that his research was fraudulent. He was stripped of his medical license. Boom, end of discussion. But as much as I hate that to be the reason, instead of a calm assessing of the facts and the evidence and this stuff is nonsense, that really did, I think somewhat turn the tide. Now you see, I used to dread April every year because it was Autism Awareness Month, not because I'm against autism, but because the anti-vaccinationists would come out and play every August. They would go wild. They would be on television. Every article on autism would feature an interview with Jenny McCarthy or some other anti-vaccinationist. And you don't see that nearly as much. If you think it, you really don't. Since Wakefield was discredited. So
I was wondering if I was gonna.
Go ahead.
It seems to me like some of that is the narrative nature, so that when we tell a story as news people, we need a villain. And so initially the villain was evil scientists, and we managed to flip it to this guy's a fraud.
Right, but on the other hand, that has another effect, because he's now the villain in the quote-unquote mainstream media narrative, but he's now even more of a hero than ever to the hardcore anti-vaccinationists, who he's been persecuted for telling the truth. Damn it, he's a martyr.
Truth is out there.
With a capital T,
I'm telling you, the truth is out there.
With the resurgence of some of the vaccine-preventable diseases like measles, I've seen people wonder, and I've wondered myself, if there's, like, if we just need to undergo this in order to remind people, like polio, right? People forgot what polio is.
Said that that anti-vaccination views probably won't go away until we start seeing some significant resurgence of vaccine-preventable diseases. I mean, he's not wishing for that by any means, but it's more like a warning, and he's probably right. Now, if you have any sense of history, though, the anti-vaccine movement's very old. It goes back almost to the origins of vaccines. And even when in the midst of smallpox, there were anti-vaccinationists. If you read some of the stuff from the 1800s, there were even groups that called themselves anti-vaccination, like the Anti-Vaccination League and stuff like that. But if you read their rhetoric, it's very similar to what you read today. So I don't think it will ever completely go away. We can only hope that to tamp it down to a level where it doesn't hurt herd immunity too much, and the vast majority of people still get their vaccines, which is mostly the case in this country, except for certain pockets. The worry is, of course, that those pockets will grow.
Do you see this becoming do you think that diseases are going to have a significant impact before we manage to get herd immunity back?
Well, I hope not in this country, but clearly in the UK that was the case. I mean, measles came roaring back, and it's now endemic there again. Same in several countries in Europe. So I don't know. I don't know if we're just several years behind the curve, or if we'll avoid that. I mean, I think they're finally starting to get some of it under control. But if you look at the numbers, in the UK and France and a couple of some other European countries, they have a lot of measles now. Not as much as there were before vaccines, though. We'll give them that. But
yeah, it's weird to me as somebody that grew up with relatives that had survived polio, and I had a disabled aunt who my grandmother was pregnant and had measles. And so for people my age, it's like, what are you doing? Right? I remember my mom taking me to get my polio vaccine and how excited she was.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not old enough to remember that, but I was kind of born at the end of the first wave of polio vaccination, like in the early 60s. And, people forget that just 10 years before I was born, like in the early 50s, late 40s, the fear was palpable. There were epidemics every year, and public places, swimming pools closed down because of polio. So it's an amazing thing that we don't have to worry about that anymore. And the sad thing is, the eradication of polio is within our grasp. If only we could get those last few areas where it still exists.
Yeah, the immune component. So, we've only got a couple minutes left here, but to finish up, I want to ask you. You've been doing this for a while. You've ended up tangling with just about every major figure, I think, in these sorts of areas. What keeps you going on this?
Caffeine. No, I don't know. I ask myself that sometimes, and I do go through time periods where I'm like feeling tired and asking what's the point. And if you watch me, like if you're someone who reads me every day, you can probably tell when I'm going through one of those periods. But something always seems to happen to snap me out of them. I mean, I'm not quite as active as I used to be. I used to basically put something up 7 days a week. I now pretty much say I will not post anything on the weekends, and I do not generally, except in rare cases. And I even now occasionally skip a weekday, which for me used to be anathema to me. But I'm still going. I don't see any signs of stopping. I might slow down just a little bit, but that in a way that might make things better, because if I don't feel obligated to crank out something each and every day, then I only write when I really am fired up. But I still mostly manage every day, and I do cross post between, I do recycle. Everyone knows that. I make no apologies for it. Every so often I'll cross post or post something that was originally on Respectful Insolence onto Science-Based Medicine or vice versa, but I usually update them or change them a bit so they're not identical.
All right. Well, as part of your audience, I want to thank you for continuing the good fight. But in the meantime, where can people follow along online to see what you're doing?
Well, there's science-based medicine, which is sciencebasedmedicine.org, all one word. There's respectful insolence, which you could just Google because the URL, unfortunately, being part of Science Blogs is not. It's like scienceblogs.com/insolence, but it's probably easier just to Google it.
We'll put up links in the show notes as well.
All right. Well, that's always good too.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today, David.
No problem. Thank you.
If you want to keep abreast of what we're doing here at Breaking Bio, you can find us at breakingbio.com, and we're on Twitter at breakingbio. You can always email us any questions or comments at breakingbio@gmail.com. Thanks again for joining us for episode 66, and we'll see you guys next week.